though he was in the form of God, he did not deem equality with God something to be grasped at. Rather, he emptied himself and took the form of a slave, being born in the likeness of men. Well, this morning, I'd like to talk about, I have two subjects that I'd like to talk about. The first is sort of about hope and faith, and the other is about why Jesus was crucified, why all of those events had to take place. But first I would like to say a few words about my impression of this book that we're reading. It certainly gives the impression that the early fathers of the church were extremely hopeful people. Jesus had died and risen and ascended not too long ago, just 50, 100, 200 years ago. And so these fathers of the church are very near to the events that happened. And they were told by Jesus that he would come back. He would come back to be with them. So they're very hopeful. And if you really hear what they're saying, it's a very, very happy message. It's joyful. Jesus had redeemed all mankind, and they were extremely, extremely happy and hopeful. Now, what happened over the centuries? How did the message of Jesus get more and more and more gloomy, and you might say not so hopeful? Rather, hopefulness went into, you might say, a dark period, just as faith can be luminous or dark, so hope can be luminous or dark. We entered into a period of history of real darkness and suffering. And you can see that the message of Jesus began to change. And the message of great hopefulness became almost despair. And so we had, in our lifetime, we had a Vatican Council. And the aim of the fathers of that council was to go back to the early fathers of the church and see if we could not resurrect this hopefulness, this joy, this great experience of the resurrection, the salvation that Jesus brought us. So the fathers went back to the fathers of the council, went back to the fathers of the church, and especially the great theologians, Van Balthasar, Rana, Ratzinger, all these great men were great scholars of the early fathers of the church. They knew the early fathers, and so they wanted to return to that period. Now, they did, and if you read the documents, you can see that this fundamental joy, this fundamental hope is really there. Now, it has become codified, you might say, in a very, very simple manner to us today. And that is, and you might laugh at this, at the insignificance of it is, but it is not insignificant. Every single funeral that we have today is performed with white vestments. Now think of it. The funerals that you go to and I go to are in white vestments. How can we have white vestments for a funeral? Funerals are performed in black vestments. You could not be more mournful and more frightened when somebody dies. And we go out in these black vestments and we start singing the Dies Irae, Dies Illa, Day of Wrath and Day of Judgment. Funeral is a frightening thing in these black vestments. And this is what we've known for most of our lifetime. And then along comes the Vatican Council and changes this whole theology. This whole theology of Day of Wrath and Day of Judgment has turned into white vestments and the celebration of the life of this person who has died and whose casket is there at this funeral. And we're out there saying we're here to celebrate in white vestments, celebrate the life of this person. And somewhere along the line, each priest will say, your mother or your father or whoever it is, whatever relative you have that is in that casket, the priest says, now they are in heaven and they can help you. That's a new theology. That isn't what we might say grew up with 60 years ago, before the Vatican Council. We were praying for them as deeply and as sincerely and as honestly and as truly as we possibly could, because we were sure that they were in purgatory, that they were suffering and paying for their sins, and hopefully they were not in hell, but at least they're suffering in purgatory. And we're going to pray and pray and pray that they get out of purgatory and possibly get into heaven. We hoped that they would get there eventually, but not until we did an awful lot of praying. For years and years, we're going to be praying for our beloved dead ones and the holy souls in purgatory. We're going to pray for them to get them out of that purgatory, because we had a very, very, very sad picture of what happened. What happened when they died was they took all their sins and everything, and now they're being purified. And we are in some way going to help them by our prayers to get out of purgatory and get into heaven. And now we've got a whole new way of looking at this. A new theology, the shift from the old theology to the new theology, or rather the resurrected theology of the early fathers of the church. It did happen. What the fathers of the Vatican Council wanted to happen, happened. And it's happened under our noses. And nobody has said a word. Nobody has ever complained that we wear white vestments at funerals. You've heard no complaints about that. But that's an enormous change from white, away from black and into white. It's very significant. Now, the other thing that I want to talk to you about is the Passion of Jesus. Why did Jesus have to die? Why did the whole set of incidents that happened on Good Friday, on Holy Saturday, and then the resurrection on Easter, why did that have to happen? Could not God have done it another way? Couldn't there have been, he could have willed that we were redeemed in any way whatsoever. But he chose this way. He chose that there would be a passion of love. Now, in your book by Clementi, there is a section right before he quotes Origen, and he talks about this passion of love. Now, I don't know if it struck you, but it's very clear there that Clementi wants to make a big point of this passion of love. What is the meaning of this expression, passion of love? Well, I think it is involved in the very plan of God for the incarnation and the death and resurrection of Jesus. And it has its origin in the Blessed Trinity. The theology of the Blessed Trinity that has come from the church, has come from the great theologians, that has come through the teaching of the fathers of the church, that this Trinity that we believe in is a cycle of self-giving. The Father gives himself to the Son, and the Son gives himself to the Father, so that one completely loses himself in the other. By this total self-giving, the other person gives himself totally to us, so that Jesus can say, the Father and I are one. They are one because they have given themselves to the other. Now, all of human life that we have received through our creation, at the very core of that life is this self-giving. We have come from our parents, and they, through an act of total self-giving, have given life to us. And now that we have this life, we are to give it to the other. We are not in this world for ourselves. We have to give ourselves to our mothers, and our mothers in turn give themselves to us. The little baby looks in the mother's eyes, and the mother's eyes are on the little baby. Something is going on between them. They do not know what it is. They don't know what to call it. But it is love. And love is total self-giving. Now, this has to happen for a child. For a child to grow, for a child to continue his progress in life. He has to be loved. He has to be held. He has to be cradled. He has to be kissed and just give every single sign of affection from that mother or a mother substitute. Somebody has to love this baby. And if they don't, this little baby is not going to be a healthy little child, eventually a healthy human being. So that if he does not get this love, he ends up as a psychopath, and he can take a gun and go boom to somebody and not feel a thing, because he's never experienced the other. The other is absolutely necessary in our life, to go out to the other and to receive the love from the other in this cycle of total self-giving. Now, this cycle of total self-giving is a revelation of the Blessed Trinity. It is the life of the Blessed Trinity. It is this life of total self-giving of the Father to the Son and the Son to the Father. It is absolutely the very being of God. And because it's of the very being of God, it is in our very being, because we were created to the image and likeness of God. And this is the very point on which we are like God, because we love. God is love, and we love, and in this very act of love, we go out to the other and receive from the other in this cycle of total self-giving. Now, why was it necessary for Jesus? Clemente says that before Jesus was incarnate, the passion of love was there. What is the passion of love? Passion, in some way, is the self-emptying of a person, a passion. In passion, there is this going out. It is a stripping of self. Kenosis. It is this term that is so important in Christian asceticism. Kenosis. We have to empty ourselves of all ego and all self. And so this kenosis is there in this expression, passion of love. So that Jesus was a member of the Blessed Trinity in this passion of love before the incarnation. Clemente makes that point. The passion of love was there before the incarnation. Jesus was already giving himself to the other before he was incarnate. In other words, he was part of this Trinity. Jesus, in the Trinity, was giving himself to the Father. So that he comes into this world and he is headed toward, eventually, this passion of love. So, it starts to happen, and he starts telling his followers that he is going to be crucified, he's going to receive this and this, he will be scourged, he will be punished. And so, the passion of love took place on Good Friday, when Jesus handed over his spirit to the Father. This is where the passion of love is revealing in time and space the very life of the Blessed Trinity. What Jesus did on the cross is exactly what he does all day long in the Trinity. He gives himself to the Father. He empties himself. And he empties himself of his human life. He is dead now. He has given his human life to the Father. Into your hands I commend my spirit. He gave up his human life. He emptied himself of his human life. And the Father, in turn, with all his power and with all his divinity, rose Jesus, if you can say it that way. He compelled the very being of Jesus to rise from the dead. And in this act of rising, he had, the creed tells us that he had descended into hell. And it is from there, it is from hell, that he rose. And Pope Benedict says that he rose from this hell after bringing light and love in this hell. He rose from this hell and took all of us with him. So that when he rose, and he said that he handed over to the Father all of humanity. Jesus, in this very act of rising from the dead, he brought us with him and handed us over to the Father. So that there is this revelation of the Trinity. This is what the Trinity is. It is a going toward the other, losing oneself in the other, in this cycle of total self-giving. And this happened on the cross. And this is what Clemente said, why did Jesus have to die? and suffer and be crucified, because it was the plan of the Father that he experience every single human pain and suffering. He experienced all of it. There is nothing that he did not experience of human nature, of human life, of human existence. He experienced it all except sin. But in the passion of the cross, which now Clementi and Origen is saying is this compassion of love, because it was all for love. For from this total self-giving of the Father to the Son and the Son to the Father, there proceeds the third person of the Blessed Trinity, which is a passion of love. The third person is love. So that Jesus revealing himself on the cross as total self-giving to the Father, what he's giving to the Father is all human suffering and pain. And that pain and suffering now is transformed into love by this resurrection, by this death of all human suffering. Everything that mankind suffered was experienced by Jesus on the cross. And in the garden, it began in the garden, to the point where he sweat blood. But it all happened there. And he suffered it all, so that we can say that I am never, never alone. I always have Jesus there with me in this particular suffering right now. And sometimes we feel isolated. Nobody understands. Nobody knows the suffering that I am experiencing. That's not correct. Jesus experienced all human pain and suffering. And because he is God, because he is divine, he can say that. Now, all the fathers of the church, all the liturgy of the church, keeps saying that Jesus became human so that humanity could become divine. And this is exactly what happens in this total self-giving. Jesus gave himself totally to us, to our pain and our suffering. And that pain and suffering now is transformed into divinity. Because Jesus, becoming one of us, has made us one with the divine. Now, we certainly don't often think of ourselves as divine, especially in the West. But it is very, very, very real in the theology of the Greek fathers of the church, in the Greek church. Divinization is a very, very real part of their theology, and I believe that it's certainly there in the great theologians of the fathers of the church, because that's what they see there in their writings, is that there's a very, very clear idea that Jesus has saved, and in his salvation he has brought us to the transformation into the divine, so that this passion of love is what the Father had planned for the Son from all eternity, that he become incarnate and eventually experience this passion of love. It is out of love that he suffered everything for us, so that we will not be alone in our suffering. So that's my meditation on that little sentence.